Knight f3, King's Indian attack, opening line. With the King's Indian opening, White retains the option of various second pawn moves. However, Black is allowed to develop at leisure. Knight f6, King's Indian attack, symmetrical variation, opening line. It is simply not possible to evaluate this position. It is like a blank piece of paper, yet to be written upon. The game may evolve in too many ways at this point to formulate an evaluation. It is easier to list what openings are ruled out as a result of these moves than deal with the possibilities still remaining. G3, King's Indian attack, symmetrical variation, opening line. Planning the compact development Bishop G2, Kingside Castle, before playing in the center. The King's Indian attack. Knight C6, out of opening book, D5, would have been in the King's Indian attack, symmetrical variation, opening line. D4, D5. Bishop G2, enables the short castle. Bishop F5, castle kingside. E6. Knight H4. Bishop G4 pins White's pawn at E2 and blocks White's pawn at G3. H3 attacks Black's bishop at G4. Bishop H5 moves it to safety. C4. D takes C4. Black wins a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Knight C3 blocks Black's pawn at C4. Knight D5 blocks White's pawn at D4. Knight F3 frees White's pawn at E2 from the pin. Bishop B4 enables the short castle. Knight takes D5. E takes D5. Black wins a knight for a knight. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Queen A4 pins Black's knight. Rook B8. A3 threatens Black's bishop at B4. B5 frees Black's knight from the pin and threatens White's queen. Queen D1 moves it to safety. Bishop E7 moves it to safety. Knight E5 threatens Black's knight. Knight takes E5. D takes E5. White wins a knight for a knight. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. C6. Bishop E3 releases White's pawn at E2 from the pin and attacks Black's pawn at A7. Queen D7 protects Black's pawn at A7. A4. A6. F4. F5. A takes B5, threatens Black's pawn at A6 with a double attack and isolates Black's pawn at A6. Rook takes B5, attacks White's pawn at B2. Rook takes A6. Rook takes B2, creates passed pawns on C6 and C4. Black wins 2 pawns for 2 pawns. Black is ahead by a pawn. Rook A8 check, skewers Black's king and checks Black's king. Bishop D8 removes the threat on black's king. Queen A1 attacks black's rook at B2. Rook B5 moves it to safety. Rook A7 threatens black's queen. Rook B7 removes the threat on black's queen. Rook takes B7 threatens black's queen. Queen takes B7. Black wins a rook for a rook. Black is up a pawn in material. Rook B1 attacks black's queen. Queen D7 moves it to safety. Bishop C5 blocks black's pawn at C6 and hinders the opponent's short castle. Bishop takes E2 leads to Queen A8, C3, Rook B7, Queen E6, Rook E7, check. Queen takes E7, Bishop takes E7, King takes E7, Queen B7, check. King F8, Queen D7, Bishop E7, Queen takes F5, check. King E8, Queen C8, check. Bishop D8, Queen takes C6, check. King E7, Queen takes C3, which wins a rook, a bishop, and a pawn for a queen and 3 pawns. Better is King F7, leading to Queen A6, Bishop C7, Rook B7, Rook C8, Bishop D6, King E8, Queen A7, King D8, King F1, C3, which results in no exchange of material. Queen A8 pins black's bishop at D8. Queen E6 leads to Rook B6, King F7, Queen B7, check. Bishop E7, Bishop takes E7, Queen C8, Bishop takes D5, check. C takes D5, Queen takes D5, check. King takes E7, Rook B7, check. Queen takes B7, Queen takes B7, check. King E6, Queen C6, check. King E7, Queen C7, check. King E8, Queen C8, check. King F7, Queen D7, check. King F8, Queen D8, check. King F7, Queen takes H8, which wins a rook and 2 bishops for a queen, a rook, a bishop, and 2 pawns. Better is King F7, leading to Rook B7, Bishop E7, Rook takes D7, Rook takes A8, Rook takes E7, check. King G8, Bishop D4, King F8, Rook C7, Rook A2, E6, Bishop H5, Rook takes G7, which wins a queen for a queen, a bishop, and a pawn. This was black's key error. Black was not able to regain the lost ground, and was eventually mated. Rook B6. Queen D7. Black moves into a forced mate. Much better is King F7, Queen D7, leads to Rook takes C6, King F7, E6, check. King G6, E takes D7, check. King H5, Bishop F3, check. Bishop takes F3, Bishop D4, Bishop B6, Queen takes H8, Bishop takes D4, check. King H2, Bishop G1, check. King takes G1, H6, Queen E8, check. G6, Queen takes G6, and mate. Rook takes C6. White has a mate in 9. Places it behind the passed pawn at C4. Leads to king f7, e6, check, king g6, e takes d7, check, king h5, bishop f3, check, bishop takes f3, bishop d4, bishop b6, queen takes h8, bishop takes d4, check, king h2, bishop g1, check, king takes g1, h6, queen e8, check, g6, queen takes g6, and checkmate. c3, advances the passed pawn. e6, white has a mate in 6. Traps black's queen, threatens black's queen, and pushes the passed pawn. Leads to bishop f3, bishop takes f3, queen e7, bishop takes e7, king takes e7, queen b7, check, bishop c7, rook takes c7, check, king f6, rook takes g7, king takes e6, queen e7, and checkmate. Bishop c4. Rook c7, white has a mate in 4. Leads to c2, rook takes d7, c1, queen, check, king h2, queen g1, check, king takes g1, bishop b5, queen takes d8, and checkmate. c2, adds a promote threat at c2. Rook takes d7, white has a mate in 3. Threatens checkmate, rook captures bishop. Removes the threat on white's pawn at e6, attacks black's pawn at g7, and places it behind the passed pawn at d5. Leads to c1, queen, check, king h2, queen h1, check, bishop takes h1, rook f8, queen takes d8, and mate. c1, queen, check. Protects black's pawn at g7 and checks white's king. Material is even. King h2. White has a mate in 2. Moves it out of check, threatens mate, rook captures bishop, and attacks black's pawn at g7. Leads to queen h1, check, bishop takes h1, d4, queen takes d8, and checkmate. Queen g1, check, removes the threat on black's pawn at g7 and forks white's king and white's bishop at c5. King takes g1, white will mate next turn. Threatens checkmate, rook takes bishop, protects white's bishop at c5 and attacks black's pawn at g7. Leads to d4, queen takes d8, and checkmate. Rook g8, removes the threat on black's pawn at g7. Rook takes d8, checkmate. Checkmates black's king.